Hello everyone. We're starting off tonight with a topic that is both controversial and academic. Medieval sex is a personal, perplexing, and often simply strange world. Chivalry and highly dubious herbal treatments were prevalent during this time. In the past, asking nicely and hoping no one was looking was the norm for foreplay. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. First, let's address the most common misunderstanding. Intimacy in the Middle Ages did not take place in candlelit rooms with silk sheets and a lute playing in the background. As it turned out, the scene was typically a tiny one-room house inhabited by a whole family, including kids, elderly relatives, a couple of goats, and a chicken with strong views on personal space. There was really no such thing as privacy as we know it today. Although they had different scents, the kitchen, bedroom, and stable in the majority of peasant homes were all technically the same square space. Couples had to think outside the box if they wanted to spend time together. Time was of the essence. Volume also did. And ideally, it made no difference if the children were facing the wall and asleep. It was a privilege to have curtains. They shared beds. Even in the upper classes, servants may be standing in the corner, acting as though they are unaware of anything, or they may be sleeping at the foot of the bed. For legal or religious reasons, many aristocratic houses maintained records of bedroom arrangements, which is just as embarrassing as it sounds. Traveling didn't help either. Beds in inns were frequently shared. Yes, complete strangers might spend the night together, which further complicated matters. Do you want some love? Make sure that no one is currently in the bed and that they have brought their footwear. You could share a mattress of straw and hope for the best if you were married and both of you were still conscious and somewhat clean. You had to be 3 times as cautious and twice as quiet if you weren't married. Walls were thin, communities were small, and rumors spread more quickly than plague. The rule was straightforward for people who lived in monasteries or convents. No privacy, no outside distractions, and definitely no whispers in the middle of the night. However, human nature often created complications even there, which is why many abbeys had garden walls that were abnormally high. The church had a significant influence on what transpired behind closed doors, or more precisely, behind shared curtains, and few things influenced private life more in the medieval world than the church. The main purpose of physical closeness, according to church doctrine, was to create more people. That was it. Not enjoyment, not connection, not alleviation of stress. Only reproduction. What else? At best distracting, at worst sinful. This was more than just material for a Sunday sermon. In case someone ventured to improvise, confessors, theologians, and bishops wrote down exactly what was and wasn't permitted. Some days of the week were forbidden. This also applied to holy days, significant feast days, fasting days, and in some places whole liturgical seasons. Do you want to spend Lent with your spouse? Rethink your thought. Advent? No too. Perhaps that left April Tuesdays. Expectations existed even in marriage. It was advised that couples approach each other modestly and with self-control. It was allowed to show affection, but not too much. Passionate outbursts were, to put it mildly, discouraged. According to a recommendation from the 13th century, married spouses should have intimate relations right away, without delay, and without pleasure or sin. It is a very dull checklist by all accounts. Not alone for religious symbolism, missionary work was the preferred approach. It was thought to be the least likely to offend God, the saints, or your local priest, because it was the most natural. Anything else was viewed as questionable. This contains things like zeal. Confession also played a role. During confession, priests frequently probed couples with probing inquiries to find out if they had violated any ecclesiastical or moral rules. These were not nebulous spiritual questions, they were quite detailed, uncomfortably so at times. Assume that the typical friar of the 14th century was significantly better knowledgeable about the bedrooms of his parishioners than about their birthdays. Enforcement was patchy, though. There were stricter areas than others. Some priests completely disregarded these regulations, and a lot of lay people, especially peasants, just nodded, smiled, and carried on with their plans, silently. If you believe that couples nowadays struggle to coordinate their schedules, consider medieval people. It took a calendar, the approval of a priest, and the good fortune of St. Valentine, who, oddly, was never married, to organize a romantic evening in the Middle Ages. The Church had strong beliefs about when closeness was acceptable, and by beliefs we mean rigid rules. Sundays? Not at all. It was the day of the Lord. Fridays? No, still. Penance Day. Wednesdays? Untrustworthy. Include Lent as well? 40 days. Advent? 40 more. You'll discover that the calendar was less structured when you take into account the feast days, holy days, fast days, and even specific moon phases of different saints, and more like a road of divine obstacles. The goal was to maintain the soul's attention on heaven despite the body's divergent thoughts. In fact, there were lists of prohibited days. Almost half the year was listed as off-limits in certain confession manuals. Enjoy your additional trip to confession and your spiritual guilt if you were feeling especially loving on one of those forbidden days. A married couple was reprimanded by a 13th century bishop for showing too much affection, which translates to more than once every month. He suggested that they focus their fervor on prayer. According to reports, the pair was not happy. The affluent were, of course, more subject to these limitations. Spiritual advisors, confessors, and chaplains were all breathing down their necks. In contrast, peasants used a more adaptable strategy. They had less time to worry about whether Tuesday was the feast of no fun because their lives were focused on cattle, weather, and avoiding freezing to death. Even worse, some people thought that having sex at the incorrect time could lead to ill offspring, divine retribution, or, worst of all, a bad reputation. If your neighbors learned that you were celebrating Lent a bit too fervently, it might result in embarrassment, rumors, or a sermon with harsh language and lots of eye contact. In medieval Europe, romance was more about entering into a binding contract than it was about falling in love. Read a troubadour ballad if you were looking for poetry, romantic feasts, and whispered confessions. For most individuals, courtship in real life entailed property rights, livestock, and two families deciding not to start a feud. The main purpose of marriage was business. In order to strengthen ties, acquire property, or restore harmony amongst neighbors who had previously spat over whose cabbage was eaten by whom, daughters were traded. A bride may present a small plot of farmland, linens, or money as a dowry. The groom's family may agree to refrain from becoming completely intolerable in exchange. When courtship did occur, it was occasionally physically overseen. Seldom did young people court by themselves. A mother, a strict aunt, or, in extreme cases, the entire village, which was deeply invested in whether or not you held hands, might be watching over a maiden. Arranged matches were common among the aristocratic. Marriages were arranged by kings and lords like chess moves, and love was something you either developed later or never. Better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples, goes a medieval saying. Practical considerations prevailed even among peasants. A man's appropriateness was determined by his ox's size, his equipment, or his land. What about women? Their reputation, housekeeping abilities, and overall capacity to avoid causing trouble at the market were taken into consideration when evaluating them. This is not to say that love didn't exist, it did, but it typically appeared after marriage rather than before. Growing fondness over time was seen as a benefit rather than a necessity. Consider it an emotional DLC from the Middle Ages that isn't part of the standard marriage bundle. However, there is always a workaround for those who are willing. Medieval dating's unofficial side activities included moonlit visits to the village well, amusing songs and covert flirtations. Just exercise caution. You might have to perform public penance if you are found kissing behind the barn, a pitchfork-wielding parent who is either okay or really disappointed. Let's dispel one of the most enduring myths regarding relationships in the Middle Ages: belts of chastity. Indeed, it's likely that you've seen them in historical dramas, cartoons, or the regrettable souvenir shops of museums. A lady was supposedly physically and morally sealed by those iron devices that latched around her waist while her husband was away at war. Not really, though. The widespread use of chastity belts during the Middle Ages is not supported by historical evidence. Actually, the majority of examples that we have today date from the Renaissance or even the Victorian Age, which were more preoccupied with the notion of medieval repression than with the real events that took place during those times. Rather than being functional devices, many of these belts were made as jokes, cautions, or museum artifacts. The dispersion of the mass belt is oddly absent from medieval manuscripts, which frequently document a variety of unsettling information. No tailors promoted them. They were not subject to any laws. They weren't distributed by any churches during uncomfortable marriage ceremonies. Stay with me for a moment. It seems like they never existed. This is understandable given how utterly unrealistic the design is. Medieval cleanliness was already under doubt. Imagine then adding a padlock that most likely needed a blacksmith and a rusted metal device without a user manual. More infections would have resulted than transgressions would have been avoided. Where then did the myth originate? Most likely as a result of satire and later moral panic. The notion of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman was popular with Victorian collectors and Renaissance moralists. It suited their story. A genuine keyhole in your underwear is the epitome of virtue. In actuality, more conventional and successful methods were used to compel loyalty. Religion, surveillance, shame, and calculated matchmaking. A noble woman's life was frequently accompanied by a chaperone. Entire villages watched peasant girls like unpaid private detectives. Additionally, any hint of scandal could result in forfeited dowries, damaged reputations, or uncomfortable confessions that use expressions like, "at the edge of the barley field." Many of their contemporary descendants would be shocked to learn that medieval cities did not simply put up with brothels, they frequently regulated them. Yes, exactly. Brothels functioned as legitimate enterprises in a number of medieval European cities. Long before the invention of the light bulb, town councils issued licenses, levied taxes, and even set off particular areas for red lighting. A few localities even hired officials to oversee them. These fortunate individuals were referred to as brothel keepers, or more colourfully, keepers of public women, a sentence that certainly sounds stressful on a resume. This arrangement was made for practical, if perhaps cynical, reasons. Authorities thought that permitting males to express their urges in a regulated way would lessen the likelihood of more serious transgressions like adultery, assault, or, heaven forbid, dancing. Like traffic signals or turnips, regulated brothels were viewed as an unavoidable evil to maintain social order. Naturally, the church wasn't overjoyed. It officially denounced the practice as a whole. However, many clergy members unofficially ignored it. Some even got their rent from those same businesses. Congratulations if that seems like hypocrisy. The core of medieval theology and practice has been captured by you. Although it wasn't always a happy existence, working at a brothel wasn't a dream come true either. Some women, particularly widows or those without family support, chose the career path for financial reasons. Others, especially in port cities where sailors brought in revenue and complications in equal measure, were forced or trafficked. Even handbooks were available. Yes, real manuals that outline the proper way to run these homes. The regulatory process included defined hours, clean linens, and basic health inspections. All social classes were among the patrons. Even monks, in spite of vows that strongly implied otherwise, were knights, apprentices, merchants, and others. Services were catalogued, entry prices varied, and clients occasionally paid with wool, eggs, or whatever clumsy barter they had on hand. It wasn't medieval Tinder. Let us establish the scenario. Your sweetheart talks, sweet nothings, a gentle breeze through the thatched roof, flickering candles, and then they take off their wool tunic to expose a potent medieval fragrance, because personal hygiene was a priority in medieval Europe. After mending the roof, catching the pig that had gotten into the pantry again, and surviving the epidemic, staying clean was on the list. Though not quite as frequently as contemporary noses would want, bathing did occur. Peasants rarely took a bath, perhaps once a month, or more frequently if they unintentionally fell into a river. Soap was costly, either imported or produced at home, and used infrequently. Even though there were public baths in towns and cities, they were occasionally prohibited during scandals, disease outbreaks, or both. You had choices if you were rich. Attendants may draw a hot bath, smell it with herbs, and then rub it with linen cloths. If you were poor, your sponge bath consisted of a frigid bucket, and the hazy hope that no one over the stables would notice your scent. To make matters more complicated, water in general, and cold water in particular, was sometimes regarded with distrust. Bathing too often, according to some, could weaken the body or expose the skin to disease. Others just didn't have the time, the tub, or any water where the local geese weren't already fighting for it. Imagine attempting to make an impression on someone in these circumstances. A perfume, mostly for the wealthy, deodorant, a vision of the far future, dental treatment. If you were feeling very fancy, you could chew mint leaves or apply ash to your teeth. It was definitely an adventure to kiss. Clothes didn't help either. Heat, perspiration, and every odor you came across during the day, including the contents of the chamber pot and the mystery stew, were caught by layers of fur, leather, linen, and wool. Nevertheless, people continued to flirt, fall in love, and get intimate. Maybe we had different standards, or maybe love was really blind when everyone smelt equally bad, as well as nose blind. Managing a family's size in medieval Europe was similar to attempting to control a cart without wheels, reins, and a particularly obstinate goat. Though not something you could rely on, it is technically feasible. People did try, to be clear. Medieval people were not unaware that contraception was ineffective by today's standards. They were well aware that some behaviors resulted in infants, and many of them took intricate, if sometimes perplexing, measures to avoid it. Herbal combinations, animal membranes, and ceremonies that entailed burying specific items close to the doorstep were some of the more scientific techniques. Drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles was one common method. Some suggested donning amulets blessed by someone who, ideally, wasn't speculating. According to some instructions, it would be beneficial to bounce up and down vigorously after intimacy, which would likely burn some calories if nothing else. Early barrier methods existed as well, though it would be an understatement to say that they were trustworthy. One method involved soaking linen in several mixtures. Some courageous people tried wax. Additionally, there are sporadic allusions to, we'll refer to them as medieval forerunners of later, well-known latex gadgets. But don't inquire as to how they were produced. You don't want to know at all. Naturally, the Church was not amused. It was common to classify any attempt to prevent conception as wicked or abnormal. Marriage's declared purpose was procreation, and anything that interfered with that heavenly mission was frowned upon or, more frequently, harshly condemned from the Church. However, not everyone complied with Church directives. The desire to space out pregnancies or avoid having another mouth to feed was extremely genuine among married couples, especially those who were struggling financially. Let's just say that the motivation was significantly higher among unmarried couples, but dependability was poor regardless of the approach. As it was, birth control relied on local herbs, folk knowledge, and a surprisingly high degree of optimism. When it didn't work out, which it frequently did, it led to hurried marriages, unreported pregnancies, and a lot of awkward talks. Not every medieval couple waited until the wedding bells rung before getting cozy, despite what church authorities like to imply. The practice of evaluating the goods prior to marriage was actually so widespread that it necessitated a great deal of paperwork. Intimacy prior to marriage wasn't very uncommon, but it was undoubtedly monitored. It was referred to as immorality in church records and getting ahead of oneself in common village rumors. Local officials maintained moral duties, which were more akin to ledgers of shame than diaries, in cities and parishes throughout Europe. A couple might be taken before the local court and penalized if they were found to have jumped the marital time frame, or even if they were suspected of doing so. The fine was sometimes paid to the municipality, sometimes to the church, and sometimes to a person who said they saw what happened. Snitching was very common in the Middle Ages. If it was a first offence, if a pregnancy ensued, or whether the couple finally got married, all affected the fines. In certain instances, getting married after the fact nullified the fine. It was akin to retroactive consent. In other cases, the fine was still imposed, although it was reduced. Early bird penalties, not to mention the societal repercussions. Everyone knew one another's business in close-knit communities. Therefore, your neighbors weren't feeling forgiving, even if your local priest was. In July, gossip may spread more quickly than a poorly preserved pork pie. It's interesting to note that a lot of these circumstances led to hand fasting, which is a form of unofficial engagement in which the couple regarded themselves as engaged. In certain areas, this was sufficient legal justification to start living together. Many medieval babies were technically early arrivals, but the church later attempted to close that gap. All of this was handled with a little more pragmatism among peasants. Marriage often followed if a couple was obviously serious and a pregnancy had been achieved. Occasionally, it was rushed ahead with a forceful push or a gentle prod from both families. However, the repercussions may be much greater among nobility, particularly if reputation or inheritance were at stake. Not only was virginity a virtue in the medieval era, but it was also a political instrument, a contract requirement, and often a communal obsession. Expectations among the peasantry differed depending on the area and situation. Generally speaking, a young woman was supposed to enter into marriage untested, at least formally. However, if she didn't, there would be some suspicion, and a shotgun wedding or modest fine might settle the issue. However, matters were terrible for the upper classes. The virginity of noble women was closely related to family honor, connections, and inheritance. A feud could be sparked by a broken engagement. Generations of planning could be derailed by an unwed pregnancy. How, then, did they confirm it? Bad, that is. It occasionally came down to character references and evasive evidence. She avoided the stable boy most of the time, or she appeared to be virtuous. In other instances, more intrusive techniques were employed, such as matrons or midwives checking for the notorious hymen, which science has since shown is not a reliable indicator of virginity in the Middle Ages, but nobody was deterred by that. A blood-stained sheet, like to a very clumsy medieval Yelp review, was displayed as part of attempts to prove virginity after the wedding. Although not common, this custom was expected in some areas, and if the sheet remained clean, it led to family drama, annulments, and lawsuits, on par with a royal soap opera. Naturally, men were not subject to the same scrutiny. Male virginity was viewed as an extra benefit. Seldom was the experience level of a prospective husband questioned. No one was inspecting his laundry the following morning, but at most he might be warned to stay away from loose company or pub maids. Religious symbolism was also associated with virginity. As pristine vessels, maidens were frequently lauded, which is lovely in theory but extremely painful in reality. Young girls were brought up with stories of terrible martyrdom and saintly ideals. Furthermore, if a marriage was dissolved due to the bride's dishonesty, it could damage her family's reputation and property rights, in addition to ruining the individual. Therefore, virginity was more than just a moral issue in medieval Europe. It was lawful tender. The answer to the question of whether same-sex attraction was present during the Middle Ages is unquestionably yes. The 20th century wasn't the beginning of human nature, but if you're wondering if it was widely acknowledged at that time, that's where it becomes tricky. The three pillars of medieval society, religious dogma, social roles, and property rights, all had a significant impact on who was allowed to love whom. To give you a hint, it was typically a man and a woman married, ideally to create more villagers. The church officially declared same-sex intimacy to be sinful, and it was sometimes grouped with other abnormal behaviors like dancing on feast days or reading excessive amounts of literature. Depending on the area, the historical period, and the individual involved, punishments varied greatly. A peasant couple may receive penance and a reprimand. If nobles had enough land, they might be ignored in silence or sent into exile. Real life, however, was messier than the church, which thundered from the pulpit. Records, poetry, letters, and even court documents describe the sexual, emotional, and occasionally physical ties between individuals of the same sex. In Latin, some monks sent love notes to one another that seemed suspiciously more wistful than fraternal. Sometimes noblewomen would make a troubadour blush by declaring exclusive devotion and sharing beds. There were also ambiguous social systems in medieval Europe. Strong emotional ties were formed by all-female convents and all-male monasteries. Affectionate discourse and vows were commonplace in knightly brotherhoods. Whether these were platonic, romantic, or something else entirely is up for contention among historians. In any event, emotions were involved, and perhaps poetry. In terms of vocabulary, there was no such thing as a modern concept of sexual identity. You stayed inside. You simply survived. Cautious, silent, and frequently allegorically coded. There were songs, legends of saints, and dubious pilgrimages made in pairs, but no pride parades. In medieval Europe, adultery was like juggling knives and handling a live chicken. Dangerous, noisy, and probably going to result in someone losing some property or pride. Let's be clear. Adultery was more than a personal transgression. A social offense was committed. Marriage was viewed as a legal agreement, a property transaction, and frequently a strategic partnership, in addition to being a sacred ritual. Therefore, it wasn't just a break when someone strayed. They were interfering with dowries, inheritances, and the constantly precarious balance of local gossip. The stakes were far higher for women. If a married woman is detected having an affair, she may be subject to forced penance, exile, loss of dowry rights, or public humiliation, especially if she has the gall to be caught with evidence. In extreme situations, adulterous noblewomen may be discreetly removed from court life, divorced, or put in jail. Think more scarlet exit, less scarlet letter. Conversely, men were given more freedom. Unless the woman's family had influential friends or the church was feeling exceptionally virtuous that week, a married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be viewed as morally dubious, but not legally penalized. However, not every adulterer was spared. Some communities demanded public confessions or levied hefty fines. Because nothing shouts heavenly justice like bronze acoustics, some judicial documents include inventive punishments like having to pay for a new church bell or parading through the hamlet in nothing but a shift. But the law wasn't necessarily the true threat. the husband was the one. The practice of honor killings was not unknown, especially among aristocrats. Medieval etiquette occasionally permitted a cuckolded man to take proper action if he learned of his wife's adultery. Naturally, his standing and the number of swords he possessed greatly influenced what was considered suitable. Wealthy people may have full-blown scandals, duels, annulments, or family feuds that last for 10 years. The repercussions for peasants were typically monetary. A goat forfeited there, a fine here, and a permanent spot in the town gossip column. The concept of permission did exist in medieval Europe, but not in the sense that we use it today. It wasn't about fervent yeses or admiration for one another. Rather, it was entangled with dowries, church dogma, legal laws, and the sporadic shrug of society. Let's begin with the fundamentals. The idea of consent in marriage was acknowledged by medieval canon law. Indeed, even in the absence of a priest, a marriage was deemed lawful, provided both partners gave their verbal assent. Yes, it is possible for two people who say, "I will in a field somewhere," to be married. Is it romantic? Maybe. Confusing from a legal standpoint? Of course. Here's the problem, though. Consent was not always observed in practice, especially for women, even though it was recognized in theory. Consent was frequently obtained after arrangements were made for noble daughters. Marriages were negotiated by families, much like peace treaties. The young woman's opinion may be firmly implied or softly asked. However, the dowry ultimately spoke more than she did. Peasant women had more options, but they were still under pressure. Refusing a match could result in social wrath or financial disaster. Rejecting the son of the local reeve, even riskier. Consent became much more ambiguous inside marriage. Wives' bodies were legally their husbands', and rejecting them could result in a complaint or annulment. According to some church theorists, spouses owed each other the marital debt, which is much less voluntary than a joint checking account. The image wasn't entirely depressing, though. Coercion and assault charges were prosecuted in medieval courts, particularly where witnesses were present or the accused lacked influential allies. Court documents from cities like London and Paris demonstrate that both men and women file complaints, occasionally resulting in justice or at the very least creating a public odor. Not to mention the literary aspect. There are many intricate relationships in medieval stories. For instance, courtly love poetry frequently twirled around consent, with everyone swooning dramatically, ladies denying, and knights pining. Even if they disregarded the response, at least they knew it was vital to inquire. You're correct if you've ever thought that the medieval church had a complex connection with sensual pleasure. It was more than just difficult, it was a little suspicious. And that distrust went all the way into every married couple's bedroom, where the church ideally hoped that nothing too pleasurable was happening. To be fair, marriage was not strictly prohibited by the church. In terms of inheritance, population, and, well, humanity, that would have been a logistical nightmare. It did, however, strongly advise moderation, extreme restraint. For example, once a month, in the dark, without a smile, in moderation. At the time, theologians extolled celibacy as the pinnacle of spiritual discipline. They were celibate saints. Nuns and monks made vows. Even married couples were urged to abstain completely and live in continence, particularly if they were elderly, devout, or just fed up with one another. A couple was hailed as being halfway to sainthood, or at the very least halfway to separate beds, when they willingly gave up intimacy. St. Jerome and other church intellectuals went even farther. He maintained that passion was a weakness even in marriage. Only for the purpose of procreation, not for enjoyment or bonding, were marriages deemed appropriate. And most definitely not because someone wore a woolen nightshirt and looked really dapper. This mindset permeated moral manuals and confessionals. Even with their own spouses, priests were to inquire if married parishioners had engaged in excessive desire. Imagine the awkward hush that must have ensued at the altar rail after that question. People continued to live their lives despite this. After courteously acknowledging the church's precepts, the majority of peasants, merchants, and even lords went home and did whatever seemed right in between taxes, chores, and the occasional peasant revolt. Let's face it, a little love probably felt more consoling than embarrassing after a hard day of threshing barley or resolving land disputes. However, celibacy marriages were viewed as models of spiritual cooperation by the truly pious. These were couples who thought carnal cravings were a thing of the past, lived together, and prayed together. Or at the very least, something better left to the less revered younger villagers. You may be wondering if medieval people truly fell in love after reading about arranged weddings, flirtation penalties, herbal birth control, dubious bathing practices, and church warnings about smiling too much. Yes is the response, passionately, awkwardly, and occasionally even joyfully. Moral preaching and strict societal institutions did not stop love from blossoming in the crevices. In marketplaces and fields, peasant couples courted each other, exchanging flowers, favors, and hushed rumors over turnips. During formal banquets, noble couples pretended to be interested in falcon hunting breeds while exchanging poems and sly glances. Emotional letters from monks and nuns are still debated by contemporary readers. Was it a desire for spirituality, or even more? Romance abounds in the literature of the time. Troubadours sang of faraway women who encouraged knights to go off and suffer horribly severe injuries. From a distance, tales of courtly love exalted desire, particularly if you were lusting for your boss's wife. Yes, the love was frequently out of reach, but hey, that's where the greatest poetry is found. Some couples get married because they truly love each other. There are records of peasants who refused to be matched by their parents or who eloped. Sometimes, to the dismay of their family accountants, even aristocrats rebelled. It's important to note that the church genuinely demanded verbal approval from the bride and groom, even if they gave it gritted teeth while clutching a goose as collateral for the dowry. Additionally, many couples formed solid alliances after getting married. They co-worked, had children, fought epidemics, and dealt with taxes, basically the medieval equivalent of a romantic vacation. Letters between spouses demonstrate genuine love, desire, and dedication, particularly during periods of separation. In certain cases, widows and widowers remarry for the sake of companionship rather than political advantage, selecting a partner with whom they enjoy spending their final years. Because despite all of the regulations, dangers, and rituals, people still desired to feel loved, ideally before curfew and ideally outside of Lent. It all started with a catastrophe. Zeno of Citium was a rich businessman from Cyprus who had it everything. Trade routes charted throughout the Mediterranean, ships loaded with valuable dyes, and the kind of wealth that gave a man a sense of invincibility. However, as ancient philosophers often tell us, fate is unconcerned with the number of ships you own. Zeno's fleet got ensnared in a fierce storm somewhere close to Athens. His identity was absorbed along with his stuff by the water. He was a trader one minute and a destitute guy the next. He was soaking, broke, and, oddly, on the brink of something far more permanent than trade wealth when he eventually made it to the shores of Athens. Zeno walked inside a small bookshop on the Athenian agora, having nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. He picked up a battered copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a work that preserved Socrates' wisdom, there. Zeno asked the bookseller where he could locate a someone like Socrates because he was intrigued by the idea's subdued strength. The bookseller only gestured toward Crates, a stooping, irritable philosopher who was passing by. Zeno thus started learning under Crates the Cynic, a man who was renowned for his almost theatrical rejection of wealth and material belongings. To make a point, he once flung his money into the water. Zeno initially found this harsh way of life difficult. He wasn't prepared to live in poverty just for the sake of philosophy. However, Crates sowed a seed in his brain that eventually developed into a fresh perspective. Zeno did not remain a student indefinitely. He gradually put his own worldview together by incorporating the logical rigor of earlier thinkers like Heraclitus, Cynic discipline, and Socratic ethics. He eventually started teaching in the Stoa Poikilai, a public porch with mural decorations that is part of Athens' painted colonnade. Stoicism acquired its name from a painted porch that was accessible to everyone, not from an ivory tower or secret academy. It's a suitable beginning, a worldview that emerged from wreckage rather than wealth. In a moment of humility, not in a palace. From the beginning, Stoicism was intended to guide individuals through the chaos rather than assist them avoid it. Its first survivor was Zeno. In addition to teaching, Zeno began redefining what it meant to live well after the shipwreck and the scrolls, after the long walks in the Athenian sun, and after the silent discussions with cynics. One potent concept, logos, lay at the core of his philosophy. For the Stoics, logos was more than just reason. It was the cosmic blueprint, the divine logical structure of the universe. Whether or not humans could comprehend it, they felt that everything happened for a cause. Despite its apparent chaos, the planet was well organized, and you could live a peaceful, clear, and morally strong life if you could align your thoughts with that cosmic order. The only real good, according to Zeno and his early disciples, is virtue, or arete in Greek, not wealth, not fame, nor even good health. They were indifferents, things that, while desirable, did not determine your moral value. How you dealt with them was what counted. And that's where the Stoic way of thinking manifests itself. Chaos is thrown at you by the world, but you don't seem to care. Anchored, but not heartless. You have no control over what happens outside of you or what other people say or do, but you do have power over your ideas, your behavior, and your reactions. It was radical. The majority of people back then, and let's face it, the majority of people today seek control, money, comfort, or adulation. However, Stoicism provided a more subdued route. Try to be good, not feel good, live in balance with nature, and accept your lot without grudges. Which analogy is their favorite? Life resembles a dog chained to a cart. It can drag you behind or run with you. The cart is moving forward in any case. How you respond to it is up to you. Zeno didn't spend much time alone. His pupils started congregating in the Stoa to talk about mastering oneself instead of the outside world. This porch discussion evolved into a philosophy that would outlast empires and become one of the most subtly durable in history. However, philosophy thrives in practice rather than theory. And a new Stoic would assume leadership in the following generation. One who fought with steel and discipline rather than just reason. What's his name? Cleanthes, a former boxer who instilled mental muscle. There was nothing ordinary about Cleanthes as a philosopher. He was a boxer before he ever wrote a single scroll or stood under the painted porch. Not figuratively, but a real pugilist who makes his living by using only physical prowess and unrelenting perseverance. However, he found a different type of strength, one that braced the soul rather than bruised, when he learned about Zeno's teachings. He studied philosophy during the day and worked at night carrying water for a gardener. His muscles and hands were tattered, but his mind unchangeable. Cleanthes personified the Stoic idea that endurance, not privilege, is the source of virtue. He didn't discuss theories that he hadn't investigated. Cleanthes exemplified Zeno's teaching that one should face adversity with dignity every morning. The hymn to Zeus, his best-known composition, is a lyrical ode to Logos, the divine reason that controls all. Don't be fooled by the title, though. It wasn't a religious compliment. A serene proclamation of cosmic order was made. Cleanthes wrote that everything is interwoven into a larger scheme, even the unpleasant portions. His Stoicism was immobile, silent, and vast like a glacier. He also gave Stoicism a more sentimental tone. Cleanthes argued that appropriate emotions, such as reverence for knowledge or amazement at nature, might have a place if they were in line with reason, in contrast to Zeno's stress on logic and detachment. He was calling for balance, not indulgence. What use is a philosophy if it makes you a robot, after all? Cleanthes wasn't ostentatious, and he didn't use wordplay to attract large audiences. He was actually made fun of by some for speaking slowly. However, his stability more than made up for his lack of eloquence, and stability was crucial in Stoicism. Because he lived the philosophy more thoroughly than anyone else, he finally supplanted Zeno as the leader of the Stoic school, not because he was a charismatic leader. His life served as a silent demonstration that one may face adversity without becoming resentful, doubt fate without becoming angry, and maintain one's sense of reality without losing hope for greatness. Cleanthes helped Stoicism become stronger. Chrysippus, the logician who transformed this porch-born philosophy into a lofty school of thought, came along and sharpened Stoicism like a blade. It's not the sort that garners praise, but the kind that keeps your spine straight when the world goes awry. Chrysippus provided the framework for Stoicism, if Zeno established it, and Cleanthes gave it strength. Stoicism might have devolved into nebulous concepts and forgotten porch lectures in his absence. Rather, it developed into one of the most rigorous philosophical systems in antiquity, thanks to a man who is said to have authored more than 700 books. They lost most of them today, but what about their influence? Unquestionable. Chrysippus persisted. He rebuilt the school instead of merely inheriting it from Cleanthes. Chrysippus was surgical, whereas Zeno had been taciturn and Cleanthes lyrical. His area of expertise, reasoning. Chrysippus developed a logic that could compete with Aristotle's at a time when the majority of philosophers relied on rhetoric or emotional appeal. Clarity was his obsession. He felt that charisma and tradition were not enough for Stoicism to endure. It has to be logical, unbreakable, no gaps, no nonsense. He improved the Stoic differentiation between our controllable and uncontrollable elements. He made their physics, metaphysics, and ethics more cohesive and unapologetically challenging. Chrysippus maintained that happiness could be attained solely via virtue. Neither virtue and friends nor virtue and comfort, just virtue, complete halt. His idea of the lectern, which describes the meaning of words, is among his most well-known contributions. Every spoken word, he maintained, had a sayable, a layer of meaning conveyed by speech and connected to logic. Although it may sound abstract, this helped the Stoics better comprehend clarity and reason, which they believed were necessary for leading a decent life. He was more than dusty manuscripts and dry parchment, though. Chrysippus was a sharp-witted man. He is said to have said, "Would you blame a doctor who gets sick?" in response to accusations that he was not living according to his teachings. He's still able to treat sickness. It was not the purpose of Stoicism to act. Chrysippus was responsible for the hardening of Stoicism. It evolved beyond a consolation for lyrical boxers or stranded merchants. It developed into a discipline that you studied, worked on, and applied to break through chaos and confusion. And that discipline would soon leave Greece and make its way into the center of Rome, where its power would be contested by both slaves and emperors. Stoicism had already withstood centuries of development before it made its way into Rome. However, during Roman rule, it changed from being a Greek intellectual interest to a lifestyle appropriate for generals, emperors, and statesmen. Syllogisms concerning lectures and abstract metaphysics did not appeal to the Romans. They desired pragmatism. They had to deal with betrayal, battles, plots, and personal destruction. and while the outside world fell apart, they needed a method to keep their inner world stable. Stoicism was ideal because of its emphasis on virtue and self-control in the face of chaos. Here comes Seneca the Younger, a playwright, philosopher, and reluctant advisor to Emperor Nero, who was known for his instability. Seneca didn't have a difficult upbringing. He was well-educated, a rich elite, and perilously close to power. His words, however, show a man who is acutely aware of the frailty of life and the allure of comfort, regardless of his status. Seneca advocated simplicity, attentiveness, and self-control in his letters to Lucilius. He cautioned against letting passion or emotion control you. However, his own life was a struggle between political compromise and Stoic principles. Even as he wrote about thrift, he accumulated money. Despite writing about morality, he was a tyrant's servant. However, this tension makes him more relatable rather than diminishing him. Seneca wasn't pretending to be a saint. He was keenly conscious of his inconsistencies. He frequently accompanied his advice to others with a silent reproach of himself. He wrote, "I am a lover of wisdom, not a wise man." Perhaps the most Stoic thing of all is to pursue mastery in humility rather than to claim it. One Roman presented Stoicism to the elite, whereas Seneca offered it to the whole populace. A former slave named Epictetus. Epictetus, crippled and destitute, had nothing, not even himself. Nevertheless, he taught that genuine freedom originates inside. "Even Zeus can't take over my head," he said, "even if you chain my leg." He saw life's challenges as opportunities for virtue training rather than as barriers. His teachings became a Stoic blueprint for inner liberation after being maintained by his pupil Arrian. Stoicism was more than just philosophy in ancient Rome, it was mental armor. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, warrior, and, most improbable of all, a philosopher king, would soon be the one wearing the armor. Reading philosophy in peace is one thing, but writing it while leading an empire that is collapsing on the front lines of conflict is quite another. Marcus Aurelius was born into unthinkable privilege and became the emperor of Rome in 161 CE. Nevertheless, his rule was far from cozy. His co-emperor, Lucius Verus, died young, his generals deserted him, plagues swept the empire, Germanic tribes pressed at the boundaries, and worst of all, his own son Commodus would turn into the despot he had hoped never to raise. Marcus didn't write any speeches or propaganda during this time. Quiet personal reflections that he jotted down were subsequently collected into the Meditations. These chapters, which were never meant to be published, provide insight into a Stoic mind under duress. They read more like hushed cautions from a weary man struggling to remain upright than like proclamations from a king. As he wrote, "I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness today." Start each day by telling yourself this. It was preparation, not pessimism. Marcus thought that by anticipating adversity, he could deal with it without getting sidetracked. He believed that people's behavior was a reflection of their ignorance rather than an insult, and that his responsibility was to govern himself rather than others. He frequently told himself that since death could happen today or tomorrow, he should behave now with purpose rather than worry. That was clarity, not hopelessness. Marcus was preoccupied with his inner life even though he led troops and oversaw a sizable kingdom. He thought that if your mind remained grounded in morality and reason, you might be in the middle of chaos and not be affected. He abstained from brutality, eschewed luxury, and, if he wasn't always able to uphold Stoic principles, who could? Like a compass in a storm, he came back to them. Though he didn't create Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius lived it more clearly than anybody else in many respects. He demonstrated that anyone who wished to bring calm into the battlefield of life, including the most powerful man on the planet, could adopt Stoicism. It wasn't just for ascetic monks or philosophers in togas. Nevertheless, the Stoic spark started to wane after Marcus. It would recede for generations before being rediscovered by fresh people looking for peace in the contemporary world. But it wouldn't disappear. Stoicism didn't quite perish after Marcus Aurelius passed away in 180 CE, but it did wane. Once at the center of Roman intellectual life, philosophy started to fade into the background. Politics played a role in this. After inheriting the empire, Marcus's son Commodus appeared intent on destroying all of the Stoic values his father had upheld. Commodus represented gluttony and vanity, whilst Marcus represented wisdom and moderation. Philosophy played no part in the spectacle that was the Roman court, which turned into a theatre of excess. Christianity was emerging as a new power in the meantime. Its doctrine, rituals, and worldview started to supplant the old schools as it expanded throughout the Roman Empire and finally became the official religion. Christianity placed more emphasis on divine grace than Stoicism did on independence. Christianity discussed redemption and God's will, but Stoicism advocated accepting one's fate. Christian intellectuals frequently viewed Stoicism as an excellent but ultimately heathen worldview, even though these concepts weren't necessarily at odds. Nevertheless, Stoicism persisted. It merely moved, allowing its central concepts to permeate early Christian philosophy. The Stoics were respected by many church fathers. Despite their criticism of Stoic arrogance, intellectuals such as Augustine acknowledged their moral gravity. Additionally, Stoic discipline was a major influence on monastic traditions, particularly among Christian ascetics. The works of Epictetus or Seneca would have felt very comfortable with silence, simplicity, the refusal of luxury, and the inquiry of conscience. Stoicism evolved into a kind of background philosophy during the Middle Ages, admired by academics and mentioned by monks but hardly fully applied. It was no longer a street-side school or a public movement. Scribes, theologians, and the odd inquisitive thinker kept it alive as a murmur in the margins. However, there are instances when survival outweighs success. Because of its calm perseverance, Stoicism's ideals would be prepared to reappear when the intellectual winds changed centuries later during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Stoicism had left seeds buried in the soil of Western thinking despite its downfall, and those seeds would sprout when people started looking for strength, clarity, and purpose again without delusion. One day, they will even appear in leadership seminars, self-help books, and yes, your favorite podcast, places no old philosopher could have predicted. The return of Stoicism did not come with a scroll. It was distributed via podcasts, books, and blogs. The ancient philosophy, which had been quietly influential for ages, was abruptly revived in the digital age and repackaged for a world full of distractions, concerns, and the need to continually optimize everything. Philosophers like Pierre Hadot started dissecting Stoicism in the 20th century, reminding readers that it was a way of life rather than only an intellectual pursuit. Not icy, but thoughtful. Healing, not cruel. Hadot maintained that Stoicism, more than any other school, was intended to be lived rather than just studied, and that ancient philosophy was initially a spiritual activity. For a new generation, that message resonated. With approachable publications like The Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy, writers like Ryan Holiday contributed to the popularization of Stoicism in the early 2000s. Holiday portrayed Stoicism as a useful tool set for resilience, drawing on the works of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. You might use it to coach a sports team, establish a startup, or simply get through a rough Monday. Entrepreneurs and tech executives quickly caught on. For high-performance living, Tim Ferriss, Naval Ravikant, and others started quoting Stoic writings as instruction manuals. The concept was straightforward. Stoicism provides calm, clarity, and control as an antithesis to a world that is fast-paced, shallow thinking, and constantly seeking approval. Mental health specialists also paid attention. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is one therapy that significantly draws from Stoic ideas. Put your ideas to the test. Pay attention to what you can manage. Don't allow feelings control your behavior. Does that sound familiar? However, there were some criticisms of the rebirth. According to some, modern Stoicism has lost its depth and been reduced to motivational wallpaper for guys who are obsessed with efficiency. Furthermore, that is true. Not every motivational saying on Instagram captures the humility or rigor of traditional practice. Nevertheless, the fact that Stoicism has endured is due to its effectiveness rather than its popularity. Stoicism reminds us that although we cannot control what occurs, we can control who we become when life takes a turn for the worse. We lose our jobs, receive a diagnosis, or wake up uncertain of our role in the world. Never has that message been more relevant. Thus, we reach the present, when traditional knowledge subtly directs contemporary thought. Today, Stoicism is paradoxical. This age-old philosophy was created to promote mental calm in a world that is currently fixated on noise. You'll come across a statement from Marcus Aurelius in between stock recommendations and cat videos on social media. It appears once more when you open a best-selling list. Somehow, a porch philosophy that dates back 2,300 years is popular right now. But because it's trendy, Stoicism isn't really popular. It is well liked because it satisfies a very specific contemporary need: mental clarity in a confusing world. Stoicism provides an internal map when everything seems out of control, including the economy, relationships, climate, and algorithms. It encourages us to concentrate on the options we still have, rather than the chaos all around us. The main queries are still the same. What do you have control over? Regardless of the situation, what type of person will you choose to be? Additionally, Stoicism encourages us to engage with the world in contrast to many philosophies that call for complete disengagement. Go to work, raise your children, and give back to the community, but do so with peace of mind rather than desire. Yes, action, but grounded action. In this way, Stoicism is a form of rebellion, not the boisterous sign-waving variety, but a quiet opposition against impatience, distraction, and emotional instability. It's the self-control to wait before acting, the bravery to remain compassionate in the face of cruelty, and the humility to realize that you are not the center of the universe, but rather are in charge of your own destiny. People are turning back to this straightforward clarity more than before. CEOs use it to lead without ego, athletes use it to handle pressure, veterans use it to process trauma, and youngsters who are overwhelmed by the never-ending barrage of digital noise and comparisons look to Epictetus for solace. It goes without saying that philosophy is not a panacea. You will still experience sadness, fail, and lose your temper. However, Stoicism offers you a unique framework for rising, introspection, and refocusing. Ultimately, progress, quiet, steady, inward progress, is more important than perfection. And perhaps the most revolutionary thing one can do in a society that promotes loudness is to be silent. With its marble flooring, vaulted ceilings, deity sculptures, and pools that steam in the morning sun, an antique Roman bath may appear to a contemporary tourist to be a luxurious resort. But it was just another Tuesday to a Roman. For many Romans, taking a bath was an integral part of their daily routine, and not just a treat. In Rome alone, there were more than 900 public baths at the height of the empire, ranging from opulent imperial structures to small neighborhood facilities. Senators and shoemakers alike took the time to take a wash. Yes, cleanliness was vital, but so were the routine, the discussion, the heat, and the rhythm of the experience. It was a purposeful procedure. The apoditerium, or changing chamber, is where you would enter, where slaves may assist affluent guests in taking off their clothes. After that, you would gradually enter the tepidarium, a warm space that started to relax you by opening your pores. The experience's focal point, the caldarium, a steaming hot room heated by an underground system known as the hypocaust, arrived next. Bathers would perspire here, use curved metal utensils and stridules to scrape their skin, and occasionally even have a massage. At last, you would dive into the frigidarium, a freezing pool designed to shock the senses and tighten the skin. The ritual's force came from this contrast, hot to cold, sweat to chill. The Romans thought that baths were beneficial for digestion, circulation, and even mood, and they were probably right. However, baths were more about belonging than they were about health or sanitation. You went in order to be noticed. You struck commercial deals, networked, engaged in political debates, gossiped, or simply listened in on the most recent controversy. Some people brought their own musicians. Snacks were brought by others. Verse was recited by poets. Under domed ceilings, philosophers debated, their voices resonating with steam and laughter. By Roman norms, a bath was essentially a democratic arena. Even emperors might be in the same room as commoners, yet status was important. Women and slaves were also a part of this everyday society, but their access was limited or their hours were different. Bathing was not a matter of vanity for the Romans. It was about rhythm, regularity, health, and society. A location where, one steamy breath at a time, the individual was somewhat absorbed into the greater hum of the empire. Roman baths were more than just spectacular. They were wonders of engineering. The Romans discovered a way to create an immersive healing center using bricks, fire, and water long before the modern sauna or heated floors. The hypocaust system, an early type of central heating, was at the heart of this invention. Slaves fueled a prothernium, or roaring furnace, beneath the hot room floors. A compartment beneath the raised floor, held up by tiny columns known as pillae, was heated by this fire. Like a soft oven, hot air circulated through this subterranean chamber and up through wall flues, distributing heat throughout the space. The outcome? The bathers experienced a steady, comforting warmth without being suffocated by smoke. It was a strategically designed architecture. Domes dispersed sound, vaulted ceilings retained heat, and a sophisticated chamber layout controlled the temperature movement from the colder apoditerium to the milder tepidarium to the flaming caldarium. Water was continuously flowing, clean, heated to precise specifications, and windows were made to capture sunshine. Let's also discuss the aqueducts, the empire's unsung heroes. Even inland bath complexes were able to function year-round thanks to the enormous amounts of water that these elevated stone canals brought into the towns. Millions of liters of water were used every day by some of the largest baths, such as those built by Caracalla or Diocletian. However, because the system was so well designed, there was little waste and a steady flow. Soaking was not the only use of the water. Nearby, the Romans also had saunas, steam rooms, and even crude flushing toilets. Subterranean drainage systems were used to transport sewage, all gravity-powered once more. There were more wonders besides the baths. They were incorporated into Roman urban life's larger infrastructure. There was constant maintenance. Fornicatores were workers who maintained the furnaces, while others fixed pipes and tiling, maintained wood supply, or cleaned the pools. Although it required a lot of work, the payoff was evident. These structures lasted more than a few years. For centuries, many remained strong. The Romans produced a smooth sensation of heat, comfort, and flow during a time when there was no electricity, no industrial machinery, and no digital thermostats. For this reason, entering a Roman bath involved more than simply entering a structure. A system was being entered, one fueled by fire, nourished by water, and molded by creativity. Roman baths were never only used for physical purification, despite all the perspiration, steam, and stridules. They have to do with information, The baths served as a sort of open-air broadcast center in a world devoid of newspapers, email, or smartphones. Here, gossip didn't spread, it moved. With togas removed and voices raised, senators, businessmen, warriors, and poets all freely mixed together. Talk spread like wildfire throughout the tepidarium. Who was having sex with whom? What did the emperor have planned? Which general just lost an eastern battle? To avoid paying taxes, who bought off which magistrate? The bathhouse was the place to listen if you wanted to know what was going on in Rome or what might occur in the near future. This was no accident. The baths were strategically exploited by the Roman aristocracy, who were aware that they were public spaces. The Senate was not the end of politics. They seeped directly into the caldarium's marble floors. In the veil of steam, a cunning patrician might unintentionally run across a rival in the hot room and make a proposal. Or maybe a customer would approach a client to offer counsel, reiterate allegiances, or make a covert threat. While relaxing in the swimming pool, emperors even participated in the game. Hadrian and later Antoninus Pius are claimed to have made it a point to frequent the public baths in order to control their image and come across as approachable, intelligent, and involved in the lives of common people. They also had wings for individual baths, of course. However, being in the public area was a declaration. You still include me, in a way. Politics wasn't the only thing that caused friction between the tiles. Deals were brokered by businessmen, lines were delivered by poets, philosophers argued about ethics. For those who wanted their cunning to be noticed, the acoustics of the domed halls frequently served to amplify voices. The bathhouse was, in a weird manner, the Senate floor, Wall Street, and Twitter in Rome. Simultaneously, it was intensely performative, bustling, and unrestrained. However, it was also the birthplace of strategy. Far away from the official halls of power, this is where real decisions, military, financial, and personal, often begin. Because masks come off when everyone is relaxed, sweating, and half naked. And the true empire whispered its schemes in the steam. Bathing meant more to the Romans than simply feeling clean and well-groomed. It was essential to both medicine and wellness. Practical self-care and old wellness philosophy came together at the baths. Physicians suggested it. It was approved by philosophers. The military even supported it. Sweating, massages, cold plunges, and hot water were all thought to balance the humors and cleanse the body. The Romans believed that health was determined by the four fluids: phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood. You become ill if these were out of balance. However, it is said that a trip to the baths, with its heating, scraping, and cooling cycle, might bring that equilibrium back. Even by today's standards, there is some sense to it. The caldarium's heat promoted circulation, relaxed muscles, and opened pores. The frigidarium's chilly plunge stimulated the senses and decreased inflammation. Stridules were used to scrape the skin clean, removing dead skin, oil, and debris. After that, fragrant oils, sometimes made with herbs, sometimes just olive oil, were used to massage a lot of Romans. These days we may refer to this as hydrotherapy or detoxification. They just referred to it as daily life. Small medical clinics were even present in some of the bigger bath complexes, where doctors, many of whom had Greek educations, examined patients, prescribed remedies, or recommended dietary adjustments. Your doctor can recommend a trip to the tepidarium or a change in your bathing habits instead of a medication if you have a cough, hurting joints, or stomach issues. There was also exercise involved. Palaestrae, or open courtyards for exercise, were attached to many baths. Before taking a bath, Romans would box, wrestle, fence, or play ball sports. The plan was to get as sweaty as possible before going into the steam rooms. Health wasn't a passive state. One push-up and plunge at a time, it was earned. Mental health was not disregarded either. The bath's cadence and its gradual methodical changes between rooms promoted introspection. The baths were even described by certain Epicureans and Stoics as locations to calm the emotions and clarify the mind. Roman baths were innovative in many respects, an integrated area for healing, socializing, cleaning, and exercise, sort of like an old-fashioned spa, but with better mosaics and a little more gossip. A healthy body was not an aim for the Romans. It served as the cornerstone of power, virtue, and clarity. And it all started at the baths. Entering a magnificent Roman bathhouse was more than simply entering a structure. Entering an artistic experience was what it was. The air itself, the materials, the architecture. Everything was intended to elevate, calm, and impress. You were surrounded by grandeur from the time you walked into the apoditerium, changing room. Vibrant frescoes, pastoral landscapes, mythological scenes, and even sly caricatures were frequently painted on the walls. The room was lined with marble benches, clothing was stored in niches, and on the better days, a servant would take your sandals while a soft melody played in the background. Then came the actual baths. The tepidarium, which served as a sort of cozy prelude to the hotter and colder extremes, was typically the most exquisite space. Large windows that let in afternoon light, colourful mosaic floors, high vaulted ceilings, and a circular or rectangular shape were common features. Sometimes coffered or domed, the ceilings were held up by columns made of local stone or granite from Egypt. The hot room, or caldarium, had steam and heated pools. Braziers made of terracotta or bronze would be visible, as well as occasionally gilded taps that poured hot water. The air shimmered with heat, and the hypocaust system kept the flooring warm underfoot. Statues and ornamental fountains imparted a hint of celestial grace. Hercules, Venus, and Apollo all appeared. The largest and most noticeable area was typically the frigidarium, which was calm and chilly. Its chilly pool mirrored a ceiling that was frequently decorated with geometric designs or painted stars. Sometimes illuminated by tiny skylights or open oculi that let a ray of sunlight shine through the mist, the water itself glistened. In contrast to the noise and activity of the previous rooms, there was a peaceful silence here. The Roman bath's entire design was intended to evoke wonder. It was more than simply vanity to employ fine marble, vibrant tilework, and sophisticated geometry. It was a statement. The baths were a proudly lavish, organized, and sophisticated representation of the empire. The design was taken seriously even in smaller local baths. Funny Latin phrases like cave canem, beware of the dog, or balneum gratum, the bath is pleasant, were frequently used in mosaics to warn bathers. These areas were designed to soothe the soul, captivate the senses, and, in case you forgot, serve as a reminder that you were a part of the world's greatest civilization. And that was before you were even soaked. In theory, Roman baths were open to the public, yet not all Romans had the same experience. The bathhouse, where boundaries dissolved but never completely vanished, was a microcosm of Roman society. First, let's have class. Emperors may bathe in the same rooms as commoners in Rome's magnificent thermae, such as those of Caracalla or Trajan. Although it sounds democratic, social divisions persisted. The wealthy frequently brought entourages, portable benches, and slaves to carry oils and towels. They might afford additional services in adjacent rooms or private massages. Some larger baths had skol, or exclusive areas that were only used by wealthy people. Even in the shared pools, there remained an implicit hierarchy. You might rub elbows with a senator, but you weren't about to chat him up. Gender came next. Men and women did not normally bathe together. Most major bathhouses offered distinct hours or separate wings. Some emperors, like Hadrian, maintained rigid segregation. To the dismay of traditional Roman moralists, others, such as Commodus or Elagabalus, permitted or even promoted mixed bathing. Women's access depended on time, place, and the whims of local authority. Women had their own exquisitely furnished baths in more affluent cities. They frequently took morning baths before men arrived in less affluent areas. Some women had frequent access, but others, especially those of lesser status, had to deal with social shame, timetables, and surveillance. A sizable percentage of bath patrons were slaves and freedmen. They were permitted entry and frequently urged to go, particularly if their job required a lot of physical effort. But they usually went in at night or in smaller establishments. However, many slaves served in the bathhouses as fire-stokers, masseurs, or attendants, and some were renowned for their charisma and talent. What about visitors from outside? Most Roman cities welcomed foreigners, non-citizens, and provincials, particularly during the height of the empire. In actuality, the installation of Roman baths in conquered areas served as one of the empire's means of promoting cultural fusion and declaring, "Welcome to Rome, now take off your clothes." The Roman baths were therefore a communal area. However, your experience hinged on your identity, much like in the Senate or the forums. Nevertheless, those distinctions can become blurry for a minute in the mist, the hot stone, and the splash of cold water. And part of the magic was that Roman bathhouses were much more than just places to wash, even though bathing was the main pastime. You could easily spend an entire afternoon there, and many people did. They were entertainment centers that included elements of a theater, gym, and lounge. Larger bath complexes actually looked like historic recreation centers. You might walk to the library, which is off the main hallway, after working out in the palestra, a courtyard used for boxing, wrestling, or ball activities. Yes, there were libraries in many baths. Romans could unwind while reading scrolls by Virgil or Cicero, which combined intellectual stimulation with physical renewal, both mental and physical well-being. The menu had both. There was also music in the air. Live performances by singers, harpists, and flutists frequently reverberated through the domed chambers. While relaxing by a fountain or receiving an oil massage, bathers may be serenaded. To maintain a light-hearted and opulent atmosphere, some bathhouses actually hired professional entertainers, such as comedians and acrobats. Additionally, there were snack counters and food stalls, frequently found in or next to the apoditerium. These tiny restaurants, called popinae, offered dried fruits, cheese, olives, bread, and wine. Wealthier customers could occasionally enjoy exotic treats and more intricate delicacies brought by personal slaves from villas in the area. Therefore, while etiquette differed, it was technically possible to eat grapes in the steam room like a luxurious ruler. Gambling was also widespread. There was a sense of mischief in the atmosphere, whether it was from dice games, sports betting, or simple bets between friends. In bath culture, these acts were accepted even if they weren't necessarily legal. People come here to have fun after all. There were also areas for private interactions in the bathhouses. Depending on the period and place, some of the rooms served as private salons or even brothels, certainly morally dubious. However, Roman society's perceptions of sensuality, privacy, and public space differed greatly from our own. Furthermore, the caldarium's smoky, poorly illuminated ambience only served to heighten the attraction. Standardizing the Roman experience over thousands of kilometers was one of Rome's most amazing accomplishments, in addition to creating an empire. Baths were part of that. From the forests of Gaul to the sands of Syria, and from the foggy hills of Britain to the deserts of North Africa, the Roman bath came to represent the unity of Roman identity. The engineers constructed roads, forts, and bathhouses wherever the legions marched. Not all of these provincial baths were exact replicas. While adhering to the fundamental Roman design, apoditerium, tepidarium, caldarium, and frigidarium, they also took into account regional resources and traditions. The warming chambers were particularly crucial in colder regions like Germania or Britain. Some bathhouses extended the shady colonnades and cooling pools to provide respite from the scorching heat in warmer regions like the Levant or North Africa. Impressive thermae, frequently decorated with mosaics, sculptures and inscriptions honouring royal generosity, were found in cities like Bath, England, Jerash, Jordan, and Timgad, Algeria. Not all of these were public works. Propaganda in stone they were. Locals were reminded by each gleaming marble slab and boiling pool that this is Rome, and Rome looks out for its citizens. However, baths were also essential to the blending of cultures. The baths provided a gentle introduction to Roman norms for recently conquered peoples. Even while you may still use your own tongue at home, once you undressed and entered the steam, you were taking part in a Roman rite that went beyond nationality, place of birth, or local tribe. Additionally, it became a symbol of urbanization. Without adequate baths, a city could not be considered authentically Roman. They frequently arrived with temples, amphitheatres, and forums, forming civic hubs that resembled the capital. Therefore, bathing was more than just a matter of hygiene. It has to do with civilization. Local tweaks persisted, of course. Baths in Syria occasionally had mixed gender areas and Eastern architectural designs. Celtic customs had a subtle influence on the bathing ritual in Britain. Additionally, ancient Hellenistic and Roman architectural styles were combined in Egypt to produce hybrid complexes with verdant courtyards and halls brimming with incense. The Roman bath became a global experience that brought unity to an empire, regardless of local flavor. A location where you may close your eyes in the caldarium and briefly feel as though you were in the center of Rome, even at the furthest boundary. As with many aspects of Roman civilization, the bath's splendor was short-lived. In the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the huge bathhouses deteriorated along with the empire. Millions of people's everyday routines gradually devolved into neglect, devastation, and abandonment. A number of variables had a part in this reduction. First, political instability, military excess, and inflation caused the empire's economy to collapse. It was no longer feasible to finance the upkeep of enormous bath complexes which needed crews of laborers, continuous fuel for the Holocaust, and clean water from aqueducts. Then the infrastructure collapsed. During invasions, aqueducts were purposefully damaged or neglected. The main function of the baths was lost when the water stopped flowing. The marble halls reverberated in silence as the once bubbling caldariums dried up. Religion was also involved. Public bathing, particularly mixed or nude bathing, came under growing moral scrutiny as Christianity gained traction. The baths were viewed by church authorities as representations of paganism and sexual pride. Some Christian emperors closed the baths or converted them into administrative buildings, churches, or monasteries, while others attempted to maintain the baths' public health value. Nevertheless, Roman baths' legacy persisted. Through heated rooms, steam treatments, communal cleansing rituals, and hammams, bathhouses that adopted many Roman innovations, the custom persisted in the Islamic world. The core of Roman wellness was preserved in a new theological and cultural framework as these extended over the Middle East and North Africa. During the Renaissance and subsequently the Enlightenment, spas and mineral baths gained popularity throughout Europe, particularly in locations like Bath, England, and Baden-Baden, Germany. Even though the Roman Empire was long gone, these brought back bathing as a social and therapeutic practice. Roman bath remnants continue to enthrall tourists today. Caracalla's baths, Pompeii's Stabian baths, and innumerable other locations around Europe and the Mediterranean serve as a reminder that Rome won with comfort, engineering, and communal ritual rather than just force. Roman baths may no longer exist, but their spirit endures in our spas, gyms, hot showers, and private times for self-care. In a sense, We're reliving the empire every time we take a hot bath or sit in a sauna with the steam rising, the tension releasing, and time slowing down, exactly like it did 2,000 years ago. Ancient Egyptian medicine existed in the temple, the home, and the realm of the gods rather than in a lab. Healing was a spiritual art as much as a science, and the individual who treated your disease might simply apply a poultice to your wound while reciting a spell. This is due to the fact that Egyptian medicine and religion were closely related. To them, illness encompassed more than just wounds or infections. It might also be the result of a disturbance in Mayat, the cosmic order that controlled everything, the anger of a god, or the incursion of a malicious spirit. Therefore, physicians, sometimes referred to as estabienbu, weren't always operating alone. They frequently worked together with priests who were experts in incantation and ritual. By applying cures and calling for heavenly protection, they combined to generate a dual force of treatment. Temples served as healing centers in addition to being places of worship. Proto-hospitals included temples devoted to Imhotep, the architect, physician, and subsequently deified healer. People would go there to sleep in the expectation of having heavenly dreams that would reveal the cause of their illness or the remedy itself. This was known as incubation, and it was a recognized diagnostic technique. Medical school was a demanding program. Scrolls such as the Edwin Smith and Ebers papyri, which described hundreds of treatments, techniques, and case studies, were studied by doctors. These records demonstrate that in addition to calling upon the gods, the Egyptians also noted symptoms, documented results, and created astonishingly sophisticated methods, ranging from dental care to wound suturing. However, incantations were more than merely ornamental. Spells were listed as constituents in many medications. In addition to a recitation to ward off evil spirits, a shattered bone may be treated with honey and linen. In the past, psychological disorders, now known as mental illness, were viewed as spiritual maladies that frequently needed a priest or magician to help. This combination of spirituality and medicine may appear incongruous to us, but it was holistic to the Egyptians. Spirit, intellect, and body all belonged to the same continuum. To heal was to address everyone. To be a healer in the country of the Nile meant to walk between two realms, one hand raised before the gods, the other mixing herbs. Ancient Egyptian doctors used their senses and experience long before stethoscopes and laboratory testing. Even though they thought the underlying cause might be spiritual, they became experts at visual diagnosis, feeling pulses, examining wounds, and deciphering subtle physical signs to determine what was wrong. Observation was always the initial stage in the diagnosing process. To look for visible or olfactory indicators, doctors would assess a patient's posture, skin tone, breath, and even urine or feces. Was the edema hard or soft? Did the discharge have a pleasant or unpleasant smell? These were not merely conjectures. They were recorded, contrasted, and transmitted throughout generations. The pulse was especially important. It was referred to as the utterance of the heart by the Egyptians. They held that air, blood, and spirit all passed through a system of channels that led from the heart, resembling a system of irrigation canals. A weak or erratic pulse indicated that one of these important channels was obstructed or disrupted. Their results frequently resembled actual symptoms and resulted in rational remedies, despite their imperfect anatomical understanding. However, the doctor would look for spiritual reasons if no physical explanation could be established. Was the sickness a divine retribution, an enemy's curse, an eerie ghost that won't leave the body? In these situations, diagnosis required more than just an examination. It required astrological research, dream interpretation, or even consultation with a priest-magician. The ultimate decision may be influenced by the way sacred creatures behave and the alignment of the stars. Physicians used patterns to classify ailments in documents such as the Ebers Papyrus. They recognized what typically happened after an event, but they didn't always know why. For example, they could recognize the phases of a fever or an infected wound. Treatment procedures were developed based on these useful patterns. They weren't always superstitious, which is intriguing. Certain medical literature make a clear distinction between spiritual and bodily illnesses. No spell was necessary if a wound could be seen, smelled, and treated. But it was time to call for supernatural assistance if everything else failed. An ancient Egyptian believed that there were invisible forces all around them, but their doctors tried to make the unseen apparent with sharp eyes, deft hands, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Ancient Egyptian doctors had an incredible toolkit of cures and recipes at their disposal. Instead of pills and injections, their pharmacies were filled with oils, minerals, plants, and animal products. Many of these were mixed with ritual chanting and surgery. The outcome? A comprehensive strategy that combined spiritual symbolism with natural science. The 110-page Ebers Papyrus, which dates to circa 1550 BCE, was the central component of their medicine. It has more than 700 prescriptions that cover anything from toothaches and stomachaches to skin conditions and infertility. Each recipe featured detailed directions for mixing, timing, and administration, and was customized not only for the ailment but also for the patient's body and social standing. Among their preferred ingredients? Sweetheart. Still used today for wound care, it is highly valued for its antibacterial qualities. Cuts, burns, and ulcers were treated with honey, which was frequently combined with other materials like crushed seeds or glue. In addition, they employed myrrh, garlic, onion, and juniper berries for their antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties in addition to their fragrance. They also included more unusual cuisine in their pharmacopoeia: hippopotamus fat, lizard blood for skin treatments, crocodile excrement for contraception, and even mummified human flesh for especially superstitious remedies. This may appear absurd to contemporary, but these cures reflected their idea that the ingredient's potency was found in both its spiritual and physical core. Minerals, like as the naturally occurring salt natron, were utilized to preserve remains, clear diseases, and dry wounds. Because of its antibacterial properties, copper was occasionally pulverized and combined with salves. Black cumin, lotus, and castor bean oils were utilized for pain treatment and massage. Depending on the condition, different doses were used. A prescription might say to combine natron, honey, and crushed sycamore fruit. Put in a 4-day application. Over the mixture, recite the following spell. Words were also medicine in Egypt. Reminding them that healing was as much about meaning as it was about chemistry, the uttered charm triggered the cure. Egyptian medicine was extremely methodical, recorded, and sophisticated, far from being based on crude hunches. Even though some of the treatments were strange, many of them were remarkably successful, and some of them are being used today in science or spirit. They reached into all three to heal, drawing their medicine chest from the soil, the body, and the gods. The Egyptians were not scared to cut when needed, even though a large portion of ancient Egyptian medicine was centered on herbs and incantations. They realized that some illnesses need more than a prayer or a poultice. They need a sharp blade and a steady hand. Unlike any other ancient medical document, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which dates back 3,600 years, provides the best evidence of Egyptian surgery. It is clinical, thorough, and remarkably up-to-date. It provides detailed directions on inspection, treatment, and prognosis for 48 cases, the majority of which involve traumatic injuries, skull fractures, fractured collarbones, and spinal wounds. The document's practicality is remarkable. Even worse, it divides instances into 3 categories: illness, I will treat; illness, I will struggle with; and illness not to be treated. That is, hopeless, uncertain, and treatable. We still employ the triage paradigm in emergency medicine today. Bronze knives, scalpels, forceps, cautery hooks, and needles were among the several instruments employed by Egyptian surgeons. They practiced using wooden splints to set bones, draining abscesses, suturing wounds, and even performing circumcisions. Evidence of effective bone healing can be seen in certain mummies, proving that patients lived for years after suffering their injuries. They also invented the practice of wound care. A doctor might clean a cut with honey, beer, or resin, all of which have antibacterial qualities, before sewing it up. In order to lessen inflammation and encourage healing, they subsequently applied bandages soaked in oils or herbal concoctions. Although there is no proof of general anesthesia, opium extracts or sedative herbs were used to reduce pain. The surgery was swift and accurate, although probably unpleasant. Just one remarkable detail. When removing foreign objects that posed a higher risk, such as embedded arrowheads, Egyptians frequently left them in situ. It demonstrates a sophisticated comprehension of risk management and anatomy. They were aware of when not to step in. Surgery had its limitations, of course. No internal operations or significant amputations are documented. They were ignorant of the modern concepts of infection and circulation. However, Egyptian surgeons were exceptionally talented within the bounds of what was feasible. They observed, documented, and disseminated their expertise in addition to doing experiments. Egypt established the foundation for practical, hands-on medicine with the invention of the bandage and blade, and their teachings would reverberate down the corridors of Greek, Roman, and contemporary surgical practice centuries later. Women's health was not a secondary issue in ancient Egypt. It was essential to the practice of medicine. Women received and occasionally provided medical care, and fertility, pregnancy, childbirth, and contraception were all given careful consideration. The Cajun gynecological papyrus, which dates to approximately 1800 BCE, is one of the most intriguing materials on the subject. It is the earliest known medical treatise that is solely concerned with the reproductive health of women. Infertility, miscarriage, vaginal discharge, and delivery problems are all diagnosed and treated in this document. Additionally, each entry has a well-known format, just as other Egyptian texts: the diagnosis, the treatment, the examination, and the symptom. Sometimes magical, sometimes strictly medicinal, and frequently both. Pregnancy was diagnosed by ingenious experimentation. Having a woman urinate on barley and emmer wheat seeds was one popular test. She was said to be bearing a son if the barley sprouted, a girl if the emmer grew. She was not pregnant if neither of them blossomed. Unbelievably, current experiments indicate that this approach might have been somewhat accurate, most likely because germination is influenced by hormone levels. Another focus area was contraceptives. As a sort of barrier, ancient doctors applied concoctions such as honey, ground dates, and acacia leaves. Although it sounds scary, crocodile excrement was employed in some recipes because of its sticky texture and symbolic power. These were early types of barriers and spermicides used to stop conception. The midwives took the lead during birthing. The laboring woman squatted on platforms called birth bricks and provided both spiritual and physical assistance. The demon Amit was thought to be the cause of miscarriages or delivery problems, hence incantations were used to ward her off. To guarantee a safe delivery, protective amulets were worn, particularly those that featured Tauret, the hippo goddess of childbirth. Treatments included using castor oil to massage the womb and having the mother inhale herbal infusions or drink combinations if labor proved difficult. To encourage the opening of the body, there was no knowledge of caesarean sections. Tragic events frequently ensued if the birth could not be finished spontaneously. However, at its time, Egyptian obstetrics was highly sophisticated. It represented a society in which life itself was a process supervised by both God and the healer. Fecundity was divine, and women was sacrosanct. They honored the cradle of life in the cradle of civilization, every herb, every chant, every spoken wish. The combination of medicine and magic may seem incompatible to contemporary thinking. However, the two were interwoven in ancient Egypt. In order to heal the body, both the unseen forces and the obvious symptoms have to be addressed, and occasionally a spoken word was just as effective as a poultice. The Egyptians thought there were numerous causes of disease, injuries, poor diet, and natural imbalances, but also curses, evil spirits, or the wrath of enraged gods. It was one thing to break your leg in an accident. A demon or even Ak, the restless soul of the dead, may be attempting to torment you if your stomach aches for days without any apparent reason. In these situations, doctors resorted to Heka, the sacred magic power believed to have been bestowed upon humanity by the gods themselves. Heka was not a stage prop. It was as real as fire or water, a legitimate divine force. It can be used by a healer to drive out an invisible entity, activate a remedy, or prevent infection in a wound. Medical manuscripts like the London Medical Papyrus and the Ebers. Papyrus frequently contained spells. Some were harsh, some poetic. O Isis, great magician, I call upon you to cool the fire in the flesh of your servant, as you cooled the fire that scorched your own son, Horus, is one burn treatment charm. It was believed that the spoken word gave the medicine heavenly power, transforming herbs into wonders. Another tool for healing and protection was amulets. Charms with symbolic meanings, such as the eye of Horus, Ankhs, or the scarab beetle, were worn by people. These amulets were thought to protect the living and the dead, ward off evil, and stop illness. Some were even applied directly on wounds or embedded in bandages. Depending on the illness, particular deities were also called upon. The lion-headed goddess of plagues, Sekhmet, was feared but also invoked in healing prayers. The deity of wisdom, Thoth, was asked to direct the hands of both scribes and surgeons. Without magic, Egyptian medicine was insufficient. The cure included the chant, the gesture, and the symbol. For the ancient Egyptians, healing meant re-establishing balance between the body, the spirit, and the universe, not only relieving pain. Death was not the end of life in ancient Egypt. Eternity was just getting started. Additionally, the body needed to be carefully and precisely preserved in order to enter the afterlife. Then came the practice of mummification, which conflated the fields of medicine, magic, and mortuary science. Mummification's primary goal was to preserve the physical container so that the soul may return to it in the hereafter. The Ka, or vital spirit, and the Ba, or personality or soul, were thought to require the body, not only a shell, in order to traverse the underworld and reconnect in the next world. Soon after death, the procedure started. The body was cleaned with palm wine and Nile water by embalmers who served as both technicians and ceremonial experts. The removal of the internal organs, which decomposed quickly, was the next crucial step. Through a cut made on the left side of the belly, the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were removed and put in different canopic jars, each of which was watched over by one of Horus's 4 sons. Curiously, the brain was removed through the snout with metal hooks because it was deemed inconsequential. Though it was also removed and replaced with a sacred amulet in later times, the heart, which was thought to be the source of emotion and intelligence, was frequently kept in place. Natron, a natural salt mixture, was then applied to the entire body to dry it out after the empty body cavity had been filled with resins, myrrh, and linen. After 40 days, the corpse was cleaned once more, rubbed with oils, and covered with hundreds of yards of linen, frequently with amulets for protection tucked in between folds. Spells, chants, and rituals, especially from the Book of the Dead, accompanied every step. These invocations readied the dead for judgment in the afterlife, and shielded them from demons. In order to represent divine authority, the embalmer frequently wore a mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed mummification deity. Mummification, which combined chemistry, anatomy, and spiritual engineering, was, in many respects, the most sophisticated medical practice used by the Egyptians. It has nothing to do with saving lives. The goal was to keep it that way forever. The ideal body was more than just a symbol of good health to them. It served as a ticket to eternity. Additionally, they practiced soul medicine in each meticulously wrapped limb. Papyrus scrolls contained the secrets of Egypt's physicians, while temples and tombs contained the secrets of its gods. Ancient Egyptian medicine was not a collection of ethnic remedies or oral traditions. It was a professionalized system with extensive documentation, and a large portion of our knowledge is derived from the medical manuscripts that have survived, which were composed with unexpected care and organization. The most well-known of these is the Ebers Papyrus, which was probably a copy of even older information and dates to circa 1550 BCE. It is more than 100 feet long and has over 700 treatments for anything from malignancies and mental disorders to stomach aches and toothaches. Frequently combined with charms or incantations, it contains thorough explanations of symptoms, diagnosis, and therapies. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a useful surgical manual composed with clinical accuracy, is another important work. This papyri reads like a war doctor's notes, in contrast to others that are full of magic and prayers. It provides step-by-step instructions on how to assess, treat, and prognosticate severe injuries, primarily fractures, dislocations, and head traumas. It offers a unique look at how the Egyptians were able to distinguish between spiritual belief and scientific observation. Another gem is the Kajon Papyrus, which focuses on gynecology, fertility, and women's health. It offers information about birth control options, pregnancy diagnosis, and even uterine surgery. These were not secret texts. Scribes and doctors studied them. Many of them received their training at houses of life, which were academic establishments housed in temples. Here, astronomy, mathematics, and religious law were taught alongside medicine. Medical apprentices would learn spells by heart, duplicate texts by hand, and watch more seasoned physicians in action. The Egyptians held that knowledge should be passed down through the generations. Each scroll, which was frequently ascribed to gods like Thoth, the deity of wisdom and writing, was a condensation of experience, observation, and divine insight. Doctors treated much than merely physical ailments. They preserved the wisdom of centuries. It's interesting to note that some Egyptian medical concepts reached Greece, particularly through the work of individuals like Hippocrates and Galen, who analyzed Egyptian medical techniques and commended them. There is no denying Egypt's impact on classical medicine. Egypt provided us with one of the earliest examples of documented, reproducible, and organized medical science, written in ink, bound in papyrus, and transmitted with intention, during a time when a large portion of the globe was still based solely on superstition. The tradition of ancient Egyptian medicine never really vanished, even if their temples and tombs were buried by the passing of time. Actually, a lot of their methods, ideas, and inventions subtly influenced the development of medicine throughout the world. They continue to have an impact on modern pharmacies, hospitals, and spiritual healing practices. First of all, their methodical approach to medicine was groundbreaking. The Egyptians meticulously noted cause and effect, documented treatments, and classified symptoms. Centuries before the Greeks codified such methods, they created early concepts of diagnosis, prognosis, and cleanliness. Long before the term was coined, their emphasis on hygiene, daily washing, antiseptic solutions like honey and natron, and even the significance of bowel regularity foreshadowed current public health. They were also ahead of their time in comprehending the mind-body connection. They understood that mental moods may influence physical health, even though they lacked neurobiology. What they referred to as spiritual affliction may now be identified as psychosomatic sickness, anxiety, or depression. Additionally, they provided surprisingly comprehensive herbal, ritual, and social support treatments. Their usage of herbal treatments has persisted as well. Today, people still utilize things like castor oil, aloe vera, garlic, and willow bark, which is a forerunner to aspirin. Some were developed into contemporary medications, while others were offered as supplements at health food stores. Additionally, although crocodile feces was excluded, their contraceptive experiments established the foundation for reproductive medicine. Their conception of the healer as both a technician and a guide, however, is arguably the most enduring. In ancient Egypt, a doctor was more than just a healer. They were sympathetic to hardship. Healing was physical, emotional, and spiritual. In contemporary holistic health, palliative care, and even psychotherapy, that human-centered model has made a comeback. Although the combination of magic and medicine may seem odd to us, it indicates a timeless reality. People desire more than simply a cure. They desire understanding, consolation, and visibility. Physicians in ancient Egypt were aware of this. Furthermore, their incantations, amulets, and scrolls served purposes beyond simple healing. They were considerate deeds. Despite its flaws, their medicine was bold, methodical, inquisitive, and profoundly human.